This episode is sponsored by Property Filter. Find great deals faster.
Hello and welcome to the Financial Freedom Podcast, sponsored by us at Property Portfolio Building. This podcast is designed by real people on their journey to achieving financial freedom, and we'll focus on people who've either already attained it, who are joining us on that journey, or maybe a specialist topic that can help you build your technical knowledge to achieving and maintaining that financial freedom. We hope you enjoy it. Hi folks, and welcome back to the Financial Freedom Podcast. Today is going to be a fun one. We are doing one of our technical topics, and we're actually going to be doing myth-busting property jargon. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. Certainly when I first started in property, I didn't know the difference between an HMO and an AST, which sounds daft when you even say that as a sentence now. So what we're going to try and do is myth-bust, translate all the property jargon that when you're getting started in the game you might hear, put it into plain English, have a little bit of fun with it, and you might even give you some ideas on what kind of strategies you might want to do in the future. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's turn property jargon into a personal toolkit for success, shall we? There's 4 sessions that we're going to do, and I'm joined by my co-owner of our development business, Tim Witt. Hi, Tim.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, of course. And the defined area. So we're going to talk about 4 key things. We're going to talk about property strategies, what they actually are, because some of them, everyone gets this wrong. Like, what's a strategy and what is a contract? It's like different things. Then the second one is how to buy, hold, and/or control property, and the type of jargon you might hear on those types of things. We're going to talk about some key planning terms, which I'm sure are just made to confuse you. And then the final is we're going to talk about some tenanting terminology. All the key things about how to start a tenancy, how to end a tenancy. So it's going to be really whirlwind. We're going to do about 9.
Try and explain it in plain English.
Plain English. That's it. Yeah, plain English. So we're going to start with actual property strategies.
Shall I kick it off then?
You kick it off.
SA.
Okay.
What is it?
What is SA? So
what does it stand for, and what is it?
Okay, so SA is serviced accommodation, right? So this is a property that is not given to somebody on a tenancy agreement. It's usually by night. It's only on a nightly rate, so you can book them for longer periods of time. It's either on a contract for a license, or it's on a contract for a fixed period of time. And you have no rights and obligations on the property. They normally become furnished. So normally it's a furnished property. Think Airbnb, think Booking.com. It's not a hotel. It's not a B&B. It's somewhere you can rent per night. And some of the things about that SA is they work in different areas. They can have holiday destinations, coastal towns. Central towns work really well, and then there's also things that you can do in like specialist areas for contractors. You can do temporary SAs that you can then convert back to property. But it's a class on its own, so it doesn't class as a standard flats. You do need to have the right planning class and permissions to be able to do service accommodation. SA. Right, over to you. What is HMO?
So HMO stands for house in multiple occupation.
Correct. Yeah.
And what a HMO is a house where is it 2, 3?
See, you don't know.
3 or more separate households that live together that are not in the same family.
Yeah, basically, non-related persons.
Non-related persons in a family. So you got 3 friends living together, 3 people that live together that aren't friends but are in the same house. That's a general description. And then anything higher to that. We'll talk more about planning classes.
Yeah, because it's a different planning class. So if you get 3 people living in the house that was a dwelling, it's a different planning class. We'll cover that in a bit.
We'll cover that later. So
that's HMO. It. That's HMO. Okay.
Next one.
Go for it.
Co-living.
Co-living is a posh HMO. Right? So co-living doesn't actually have a technical class of its own. It's more of it's still a shared accommodation. And it's more to do with the standard and quality of the living. So co-living, as you see it advertised, is more synonymous with ensuite rooms, higher spec kitchenettes, higher spec kitchens, just sort of like higher quality finish maybe, so you see some down with paneling on the walls, But yeah, it's higher quality than you would not. That's generally the term than you would have normally seen in your standard, bog standard HMO. Certainly the ones that I lived in as a student and a young professional. Okay, over to you. This is going to be a bit of a challenge one. Social housing.
Right. So I would say social housing is a property that is then leased out to, say, a registered provider.
Okay. I'm going to challenge you on that. I think there's 3. You've got a property that's leased to one of those 3. It's not a registered provider.
Right. You've got a charity.
Charity.
So it can be leased out to a charity, a registered provider.
Community interest company. Is it company? Community interest company. Yes. CIC.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, there's 3, isn't there? There's those 3.
3, yeah. On a lease, it's not straight private sector rental. It's not a family home. It's leased out to one of those 3 types of providers, housing providers. You
can do private sector and still call it social housing if you're allowing benefit-based tenants to live in your property. You can still qualify it as that. But more traditionally, when people are talking about I want to do social housing, it's because you're putting it on a lease and you're giving it to one of those 3 people. Right, go for it.
BTL.
BTL, buy to let. This is your traditional, this is the easy one, isn't it, really?
It's an easy one.
It's a traditional dwelling house, C3 class, which we'll talk about later, that you are letting to a single or joint AST. So it's an assured short or tenancy normally.
Yeah, there's one AST.
There's one AST.
One household.
It can be up to 2. Normally it could be 2 people can sign on that AST. It doesn't have to be just to one person. But it's one household. So it's a house or a flat in normal terms. It classes as a buy to let, something that you bought, you own, and you rent out.
Yep.
Okay.
Right. Easy one.
Freehold to leasehold conversion. Freehold to leasehold.
Right. So you've got a property that on the title is one freehold property. There is no lease in it currently.
Yep.
And you then decide that you can split that one property into different segments. And by doing that, you can create a lease for the different segments of that property. So a base example could be one big house, which could convert to, say, 3 flats.
Yep.
And then what you do is you create 3 leaseholds for those 3 flats that you can do by splitting the freehold down. Through that conversion process.
Very good. Yeah. So you create this creation of new leasehold property under a freehold title.
Yeah.
Now the strategy is more to do with finding unbroken freehold blocks that are already normally converted. Yeah. And then you buy it at a price, and then when you do the works to
so what I mentioned was converting it. So you've got one house that isn't converted. You then convert it via the refurbishment works and you split the lease. But like you said, you can also buy an existing block that is one freehold title that may already be 3 flats. And then you split the titles into 3 leaseholds, which potentially could add some value as well in doing that process.
Yeah, because normally if it's one unit, there's a conservative estimate over that one unit. But if you split it up, generally speaking, you're on a more general valuation for the market.
Yeah, because you could sell those 3 leaseholds as 3 separate properties at that point instead of one.
Just less risk, property. For the overall lender. Okay, it's not as easy as it sounds, to be fair. Although if you do go to Rightmove, search 8-bed and above properties, and then you'll probably find some freehold blocks. Right, go for it.
Flipping.
Okay, so flipping. So flipping, again, not necessarily a technical term, but it's basically and we're going to talk about the flipping because we've got trading as well. We're going to talk about flipping as buying something that requires something to be done to the property, performing that work, and then bringing it back to market. So that's the more
trying to sell for
a profit. So it doesn't matter on the avenue of sale, whether it's auction or private treaty, but you are buying something, you're going to do something to it, and then you're going to get a markup on that, ideally to try and sell that back to the market.
Great. Yep.
Okay. Trading. It's probably the way around. You shouldn't flipping. I shouldn't trading.
You know more about trading than me. But anyway, so trading, I believe, is finding a property, not necessarily completing a refurbishment work and then selling it, quickly or, something like that. So an example could be you find a property, let's say it's below market value. Mm-hmm. So let's say the market value is, say, 190, you find it for 150 £150,000, you've negotiated a really good deal for whatever reason.
Yeah.
There might be a small thing you might have to do to sort out that property, but not necessarily a full refurbishment.
Yeah.
And then you say you sell it straight away, say on an auction site or something like that. And then you pick up the profit from that.
Exactly. So you aren't necessarily into what you can do is some of the things we're going to talk about in the how to control property is use an option maybe to control the property, or you can buy it. If it's a probate property, as an example, that's quite a common one because there's no stamp duty. If you do no less than 10K's work to it and then you sell it on, I mean, check with a solicitor, that's not advice. So those types of things exist. Buying a property out of one auction, putting it back into another auction that's more suited for that particular property, that works as well.
Yeah, so
there's lots of different things you can do, but
let's say you've got a residential property that you found on a commercial auction site.
Yeah,
it's not got the interest because it's marketed incorrectly. Yep. Then you pick it up, put it on a nationwide residential site, and you can get a better price for it.
Yeah.
Assisted sale.
Again, not a technical term. It's more of a concept that you can bring to market. Again, assisted sale, you can use any of the contracts that you're going to do, including exchanges like completion or lease option. And all you're going to do is you're helping the seller to sell their property. So you're going to go to a property that's in distress. Maybe it's been on the market a while, or maybe it's unsold at auction or whatever. And you're just going to say to that seller, look, you've got a problem. I'm going to help you solve a problem. And then we're going to sell that onwards. And we're going to either, I will guarantee you the price here, and then I will make my money on the onward sale. So you're either going to buy that property at the price, or you're more likely going to control that property on an assisted sale and then bring it to market later down the line. So you only then spend your money necessarily on the works that might be done to then make the profit later. So that's generally speaking an assisted sale. Right. So over to you. Below market value.
BMV. I don't really like this term that much.
Okay.
But my definition of that term is if you are very certain that the market value for a property in the open market is, say, a certain value, and you can get that property for a lower value. So an example would be if something's fully refurbished to a good spec, and on the open market, that it's going to get £200,000 on Rightmove. You've been able to secure that for, say, £150,000, £160,000. That's the below the market value. Where I think this term, where I have issues with this term is that sometimes there's a property that's, say, £200,000 that's done up to a good standard. Then there's something getting sold for £150,000 that needs quite a bit of work. Let's say £25,000, £30,000 to get up to that standard. People use that as, it's below market value, but really you should be getting an uplift with the development works anyway. So that's where I think that's
more of a flip.
That's more of a flip to me. So that's where I think this terminology goes wrong.
Below market value is a discount on the current value of the property. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So the current value, not what it might be at the end. So if it's worth 150 now because you've got to do 35 grand's worth of work and then make a 15 grand profit, then that's not below market value. If it's 130k when it could be 150k because somebody wants to sell it quickly, there's another 20 grand in there. That would. But
then the debatable topic is what is a realistic uplift for profit from a development?
I mean, you could argue that.
That's why it's a very when it's done up to a good standard.
The standard,
it's very hard to argue because
the standard below market value property is, to me, is you buy something at a discount, needs absolutely nothing doing to it. You bought a discount for whatever reason, it's at a discount. It's a distress sale, or somebody needs the money quickly, or
if you're buying with cash because they need the money in 4 weeks or something, then that's fair enough. You've got a good discount. It's below market.
That's below market value. Okay, right.
Definitely.
Next one.
Great. Off-market deals.
Off-market deals. I hate this term. Right, so. I get this all the time. It's a very overseas thing as well when people come to us and say, I'm only interested in off-market deals, right? So this is my opinion. All off-market means is it's not on Rightmove.
Or Zoopla.
Or Zoopla, or other advertising portals are available. Really. So if the property is for sale, then it is on the market as far as I'm concerned, because if you don't buy it, somebody else can buy it. However, what it means more so is you've probably got something which is another term which we'll include in this, which is direct to vendor. And it's off market because it's not being advertised in general spaces. So it's been given to you for a private sale on a private basis. So we've done some properties that we've tried to sell in that way, it's not necessarily been advertised for whatever reason, didn't upset a tenant, didn't upset somebody or whatever. So you would class that probably as off market. But the most common ones are you're targeting property that might not necessarily be for sale at that point as well. That's a good way to generate it. So that to me is the most off market something to get. You've done something. If you're
convincing someone to sell it, and they haven't been advertising or wanting to sell it,
you've approached them to sell, and they've said yes.
That's fully off market.
That's off market in my opinion.
Yeah.
But there's lots of other ways to describe off market. But it's a very debatable topic as to what off market is. In my opinion, if somebody has made the decision to sell, the second they make that decision, it becomes on market, and then it's just about how on market.
I agree, because there's a lot of stuff on the market that's is just getting sent out to say investor lists and things like that. It's not necessarily on Rightmove or Zoopla, like you said, but it is on the market. They do want to sell it.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the key things to consider with this description is that, if you approach someone that doesn't have something on the market, it's very hard to get them to sell it because they're not intending to sell it. So you might spend a lot of time doing that just to get an off-market deal that is probably not even better than the one or the 99% that are on.
Yeah, and the big thing is it isn't necessarily a good price or a discount.
No.
Because you might have approached them to sell it and they go, well, what are you willing to pay me? Right. Yeah. And that's the traditional.
Because I've done a lot of letters to landlords, using that strategy. And a lot of them just come back. Let's say I think the market value, I think it's worth £400,000. They come back saying, yeah, I'll sell it to you, $550. We've got a deal.
Yeah.
And that's just because you've approached them.
Yeah.
It's like you going, anyone that's tried to sell something to a salesman, if you're approaching them first, who's got the power of the negotiation?
Yeah, the power's not with you, is it?
Power's not with you. Right.
So commercial and mixed use property.
Right. So commercial property, to start with that, is a property that's used for non-residential use. So, it could be an office, a shop, anything that is a commercial or business in nature. Mm-hmm. Mixed use is a property that has two different types of use. So it could be, say, a residential use and a commercial use. For example, this could be commercial use on the ground floor, and the upper floors residential use.
It's the most traditional mixed use.
Yeah.
Mixed use. Although mixed use could determine different types of commercial use, because different commercial things have different commercial classes.
Yeah. So if you've got two types of commercial property on the same property
plot, technically it's mixed use. I would still class that as commercial.
But a lot of people would just say that's commercial. But if you've got a class E on the ground floor and then a class, what's another?
G? I don't know.
Class G commercial.
Sui generis.
Sui generis. Yeah. But sui generis could be residential.
Could be residential,
as well,
absolutely.
Or it could be commercial. But if you got sui generis commercial and a class A, technically that's a mixed use.
Commercial and mixed use property is actually a good strategy in its own right? It's because you can have multi-use commercial, you can have split it down and that kind of stuff. You can mix use, you can mix it up. Great strategy in its own right. It's a different type of tenant, but it is a great strategy. I think it's quite slept on. Most people go straight residential.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you think generally in a high street, the most valuable commercial is on the ground floor where the footfall is, and then technically the upper floors might be better as residential. That's why it can work that way.
Okay.
Right, blocks of flats.
I mean, this pretty much is Ronseal, isn't it? It is what it says in the tin, which is you are operating a block of flats. Now, if you're doing that, then generally you're the freeholder of that block. And you have a bunch of leasehold flats. So there's a few things that you also need to consider, because it's not as easy as it sounds owning a block of flats, because you become the freeholder. There's generally services that you have to provide, service charges that you'll have to implement into your leases and stuff like that, because you've got to maintain the common areas and the external areas and that kind of stuff. So it isn't for the faint-hearted, but it is a level up from your standard buy-to-let products. Is to try and secure these, and you can get discounts on blocks of flats, right? So it's because you're normally it's in a higher cash requirement category, so there's less competition than your 150 to 200 grand buy-to-let on the general street. So it is a good strategy. A lot of people want those kind of things because it's a good cash flow, good income, and generally good capital growth. So, so that's what that means, right? So that brings us to the end of their actual property strategies. So for me, a property strategy is one of those things, and then combined with who's your tenant type, right? So we haven't talked about tenant type. We won't talk about it here because we want to talk about property strategies. But property strategy could be HMO for social use, as an example.
Yeah.
It could be HMO for working professionals, or it could be. We should have probably put working professionals in jargon in here. I don't think we have. Or it could be buy-to-lets for families. It could be buy-to-lets for social use. It could be any of those things, right? So it's just your strategy is probably a combination of one of those things and your end user. Oh, don't forget about your end user.
Yeah, 100%.
Right. So shall we go from property strategy jargon to ways to buy, hold, or control property? And this is the one for me, because the common misconception is these are property strategies, when really these are ways to control property that you would still have to combine with a property strategy and a tenant type. So if you've got your tenant type and property strategy sorted, then you can use these things to try and control the property.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'll go first. Exchange with delayed completion.
Yeah. So what?
EDC.
EDC. Yeah. Let's. So EDC is exchange with delayed completion. So what that means is you exchange contracts between the buyer and the vendor, and then you will delay the actual completion purchase of that property until a certain time. So, that could be 3 months, it could be years, depending what you've agreed in the contract. And also it can be there can be conditions in that contract that affect the final purchase. So as an example, a common one that we use is exchange with delayed completion, conditional on achieving planning approval for such and such use or such.
So we've got taken our strategy, which is, let's say it's HMO as an example, for our working professionals, and then we've used our EDC to control the property to get the planning for that strategy. Yeah. That's a good example. And the other thing about what people don't understand about exchange and delayed completion is exchange and completion happens on every purchase.
Yes.
Right. So the normal scenarios, if you're buying a house that you're going to live in, they happen either same day or next day. They're quite quick.
Yeah.
That's a
common one is exchange, one day and then complete in a week's time or the next day or something like that. And there's also simultaneous exchange completion, which is obviously at the exact same time.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Great. So next one, lease options.
So this is one of the most powerful tools in property, right? And it is a contract, and you can apply this in 1,000 ways, right? But ultimately what you're doing is you are taking an option over a property that you can buy later and lease it in the meantime, right? For your use. So, and that's all you're doing, right? So that's all that is. So there's all sorts of ways into it. So some call it peer purchase lease option. It's a lease option. The actual contract is a lease option. So PLO, lease option, all the same thing really. It's just an option to buy something. And normally what would happen is you could do these over whatever time frame you desire, right? You could set this lease up for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It doesn't matter. It's whatever you and the seller.
And you've got the option, but not the obligation to buy, don't you?
That's it. It's an option to buy, not the obligation to buy. And that's why it's so powerful as a tool.
That is the big difference between exchange of contract delay completion, isn't it? Because once you exchange, as long as the conditions are met of the contract that we've mentioned, you pretty much have to buy.
Yeah, exactly. So one we did recently, we exchanged to get a lawful certificate for the use class because there wasn't any planning in place, and also to gain vacant possession because we were unhappy with an undocumented tenant, which means we didn't have any documents for no contracts in place. So we said, right, we'll get rid of those two things and then we will complete. As an example, if that was an option, we then have to buy it. If that was an option, we wouldn't have to buy it if we then found something in the interim. So that's the big difference between those two things. But I mean, lease option is really, really powerful because you can control the property, you can you can earn rent. And then you can buy it at a future time at a predetermined price, and you can do all sorts of deals with the landlord. You can do shared rent. You can do anything you want to do. You can pay an option fee of £1, or you can pay an option fee of £1 million. It doesn't matter. You can pay whatever you want as an option fee. And you can put some conditions in.
Generally, I'd say the lease element of that term is that you're paying a monthly fee, isn't it? Because that's the lease that you've agreed an amount per month
on a lease option. Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
So if anyone hears the term PLO,
Yeah.
That's what that is in essence. It's having an option agreement, but paying a figure generally on a monthly basis or
anything
or
that's a lease
basis.
option, you're going to be leasing it under an option, as an example. So I bought a commercial property, had a lease option. He didn't want anything as a lease, so the lease fee was nil.
Yeah.
But I was able to rent it out. So I rented it out for a year. The deposit for that property was 30k. I earned 16k in the year. Property cost me 14k on completion. Great deal. It's a great deal.
That's good.
Okay, this one, vendor finance, which is more actually called as an installment contract, vendor finance or installment contract. Go.
Right. So vendor finance is generally where you're buying a property and the vendor is giving you a loan to help you purchase that property.
Yeah.
So a way that could work is if there's a property that's, say, unencumbered, there's no mortgage on it, and you know that through discussion with the vendor or checking on the land registry. And the vendor, let's say the sale price is £1 million, and it's £1 million unencumbered, but the vendor only needs or wants, say, half of that on the completion. So, there's £500,000 they want, £500,000 they don't need straight away. What you can do is you can agree that that £500,000 is vendor finance. So that covers your costs, or say your deposit, your stamp duty, and all these sort of things you have to pay to purchase the property.
Yep.
And then you have a loan agreement in place that you can pay that back in the future.
Yep.
And that vendor can earn interest on that loan during the meantime.
Which could be a win-win if they don't need all the money, right?
Yeah, if they don't need all the money, and it's also a way that you can actually offer higher than the asking price, because if you're paying interest, let's say in that scenario there's 50 grand of interest with that loan period, you could offer the asking price, say, plus 50 grand depending on the numbers, and overall they get 50,000 more than the asking price, but they just get half of it now and the other half plus interest in 12 months time.
Yep.
And in that period, you might add value to the property with a refurbishment conversion. You might put some leases in place if it's a commercial property. You might put some rents up, et cetera, add value where you can help to pay back that loan and refinance in the future.
Yep.
Right. So the next one, very similar to before, option agreement,
right,
or beyond lease options.
Yeah. So an option agreement is very similar. They're not the only difference really is you're not going to lease the property. So you could call it a purchase option or an option to buy or whatever you want to call it, but it's an option agreement. And these things exist. Let's say somebody needs some money quickly. You quite like the property. You don't want to pay the whole thing out, but you're happy to buy it at a price in the future. And they say, right, I'm desperate. I need 30k. The property's worth 150k, which I'll sell to you. You say, well, I can't give you 150k today. But I can give you the 30 and I'll buy it 150k in. You can keep the property for the next 3 years and I'll buy it then. So then you get the capital uplift or whatever in the property.
If there is capital uplift,
yeah, if there is. You take a bit of a risk, but it's more to do with the option to purchase that in the future. That's all it is. That's all.
Yeah, and also you could use it for a scenario that you need, say, planning approval for. You've got the option to buy it, and you can buy it once the planning approval comes through or something like that.
Yep. Rent to rent.
Right. So rent to rent is what it sounds like. So you're renting a property off someone and then you're then renting it out to someone else. So an example could be, say, a HMO that we talked about before.
Yep.
You rent that off the landlord. So you pay them a figure per month and then you rent out the individual rooms, separately. So let's say it's 6 bedrooms, you have 6 ASTs that are for you, and then you rent one agreement or agreement with the landlord.
Yeah, it's a management agreement.
Agreement.
Yeah, rather than a standard tenancy agreement.
Correct.
So you wouldn't become the tenant, you become the manager of that.
Yeah.
And they give you rights to use it for whatever use you want, in effect.
Exactly, yeah. So another example could be you have a management agreement where you rent off the landlord and then you turn it into, say, service accommodation that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So that would be a rent to SA.
Yeah.
What I said before is a rent to HMO.
Yep.
You could also do it to social housing if you got a lease.
Yeah.
That the term could also be a back-to-back lease. Similar terminology.
Yeah. So it's basically you're the middle party, and you've got one party that earns income from you, based on whatever the management agreement fee is, and then you're going to charge your onward tenants a fee.
The key thing to note is if you've got the management agreement, you do not own that asset. So, the owner gets all of the capital growth and appreciation and everything like that because they own the property.
Yeah.
But it's a good way. Well, it's an entry level way that you don't need a lot of funds necessarily, because if you don't have the funds to buy a property, you can do a rent to rent and try and make cash flow.
Yep.
We've talked about our thoughts on rent to rent on other episodes, so we won't get into too much detail. But that's the explanation. JVs.
Yeah. So JV. So this is a joint venture. Yeah. So basically, what you're doing is you are entering into a property business relationship with another party, and you are going to do something in property with that venture, if you like. So it can be between two people, or it can be between a person and a company. It can be between two companies. So all that matters is that you are entering into some arrangement. Any of the previous strategies work, but most commonly it's like buying something. So let's talk about that. You can do rent to rent on a JV, you can do options on a JV, but let's talk about buying a property. So you can have parties, and those parties can have different reasons for being in that joint venture.
Yeah.
So as an example, if you are time poor, cash rich, then you may want to fund the joint venture. Whereas if you're cash poor, time rich, but an expert in your field, you may want to apply your time to that joint venture. And that's the most typical one that we see. So a lot of our JV partners are cash funders, and they use us as the development business to do the work. As an example, we enter into a joint venture arrangement. Normally there's a shareholder agreement that governs the relationship between those two. If they're actually on the deed or whatever, and then that dictates what happens in the future. So a joint venture starts and ends with that shareholders agreement. So if you said, oh well, we're going to keep the property for 10 years and then we'll take a vote on selling it or whatever, then that's the next natural.
And there's obviously some joint ventureships which are short term. Say you're like flipping a property, like we talked about before, to sell, or trading or something like that. And there's also the long term, which you're keeping the property for the long term.
It's a good way if you don't want any more companies as well. You can use different types of you can use a different type of contract. So it doesn't have to be on the company or on the company's house, or it doesn't have to be on the land registry. You can use a declaration of trust as an example, which is another way to enter into a partnership with somebody where you declare a trust over that asset, and you don't necessarily become the director or the responsible person for that company. So that's another way to look at it. But joint ventures traditionally are, between two parties or more parties, where everybody has a role and a responsibility in that arrangement, and then you just share the proceeds and the asset until that asset expires for whatever reason.
Stop the podcast now. This episode is sponsored by Property Filter. Property Filter is the #1 property tool for today's property professional. It brings in all the data points and sources from all the property portals and auction sites into one convenient place. Then you have the option to overlay all the clever strategies found in the Property Filter blueprint to find motivated sellers faster. Now, we use it on a daily basis. It saves us over 80% of our time when looking for properties. And if that sounds like something that you want in your lives, please go to register.property-filter.co.uk/PPB, which is the discount code for this podcast. You will get 2 weeks free and a discount on your first month. That's it from me. Back to the podcast.
Final one, company structure, aka SPV.
So SPV stands for Special Purpose Vehicle.
Yep.
So what that means is you have a company as an SPV that's specifically generated for a set purpose. So in property, as an example, to buy a property or to do a development or something like that. So the positives from that is, like if you've got a joint ventureship, you might have an SPV company with that joint venture that you've created that company specifically for a property or a property portfolio or a development or something like that.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, an SPV, and the important thing to note on an SPV is if you set one up to hold property, don't trade in it. Because it's specifically for that purpose. It's a special purpose vehicle.
Yeah.
So if you're holding property in there, don't then go and start invoicing for project management services or sourcing services, because that, your mortgage companies won't like that. If you're taking finance and bridging, they won't like that. Generally speaking, tax is harder. I mean, you put and a company's house, when you set this company up, you put in your codes, right? Your PUC codes, which tells you what that company does.
SIC code.
SIC, is it? SIC codes, that's it.
SIC codes, yeah.
That's a put codes. That's when you change your mobile, isn't it? SIC, yeah. So SIC, yeah, I got that confused. So you SIC, so you code at company's house.
Too many abbreviations and letters and everything.
This is why we're doing it, right? So you get rid of that. So that tells you what you can and can't do in the company, generally speaking, and you want to stick to those. You want to stick to that.
Make it as clean as possible.
Make it really clean. Yeah, absolutely. Right, then we're going to move on to something that's a bit more technical, which is key planning terms. This comes up for landlord developers all the time, and it is quite confusing. So away you go.
PD.
So this is the most common one. So it stands for permitted development. Okay. So development is the key word here, because development is classified under planning as a specific thing. So it's either operations or material change of use. They're separate under development.
Yep.
Okay, so it's really key that everybody understands the word development when they're looking at planning. So operational things that you can do under PD might be like a dormer, it might be use of a basement, it might be an extension to a property, those kinds of things. And then for a
5-bedroom house, which is one family, that you then rent out the rooms to 5 different houses.
No, that is change of use. That's a separate part of development.
No, but if it's a non-Article 4 area, it's still development.
It's still development. So what I'm talking about here, yes, you're right, but what I'm talking about is the different ways that development is classed under PD. Okay, so the general permitted development order. So it's not that it wouldn't need planning, this type of stuff. It's that it's generally permitted under planning as a development order. So you don't need to go to the planning office. It's permitted. So the general permitted development order is your planning permission. So if you're going to do one of those activities on a different type of property, as an example, that doesn't have come under the general permitted development order, you still need to apply for planning. So if you already have something like a 6-bed HMO, as an example, and you want to add a dormer, well, you can't do that without planning, because generally there's planning requirement.
Yes.
But if it's a C3 property, which is a standard dwelling house, then you can. Because there's a general permitted development order for that.
Permitted development for that.
So it's really important that you differentiate what is operational development versus change of use, which is what you talked about. But also there's things that don't class as development, which don't come under either, and then but also aren't required. So it's worth making your way through that as well if you're thinking about doing PD. Partition walls isn't generally required from a planning perspective. Just like new boiler, that kind of stuff, that you can just do internally. But anything externally, anything that changes the facade or the outlook of a property is generally under development, under planning.
So an extension, say a 3-meter single-story extension.
Yeah, but there's a general permitted development order that gives you the planning right to certain elements, but there is always a restriction.
Often confused with prior approval, so we'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, okay. So Article 4 direction.
Yeah, so an Article 4 direction is something that the council can do in an area to remove the permitted development rights that you've mentioned before. So 2 prime examples would be if there's permitted development rights to go from a C3 dwelling, C4 HMO.
Yeah.
If the council decides they put an Article 4 direction in place, they're removing that permitted development right.
Yep.
You will now need to get planning approval to do that development.
Yeah.
Another example is a conservation area. So in a town centre, if the council puts a Article 4 direction in place for conservation, you can't do some of the permitted development.
Yes, you couldn't have the dormer if that particular building's under the Article 4 area or whatever.
Correct, yeah.
Perfect. That's perfect. That's it. That's what it is. An Article 4 direction removes the rights given to you
under what you said under
the
permitted development
order. Yeah, perfect.
Prior approval, which I just touched on before.
Yeah, so prior approval. So prior approval is it's using permitted development rights, but there is still some consultation with the internal council departments. That's the way I would best describe it. You need to get approval to do something. So generally, what we're talking about here is where on a national framework basis, a permitted development right has been granted, prior the planning office approving the use of that against certain criteria. Now, typically, those criteria are that it doesn't negatively impact highways, fire safety is okay. Waste management is a really big one.
Noise.
And noise is an example. And
flood risk.
Flood risk as well. So, and it's brought in, it's more used in where you're converting something that is non-residential to residential. So it's something like a commercial property to a residential property. So there is a permitted development for Class E under a couple of different planning classes, which we're going to talk about in a little while. I know it's not going to talk about now, where you can convert, let's say, an office to a flat under certain conditions. But you can do that. So the internal and all that kind of stuff that you need to put in for a residential property, you can just go ahead and do. But before you do that, they want to check that highways are okay with it. They want to check that the flood risk is manageable. They want to check the noise safety, because if you're in the town centre, they want to make sure that you are doing the right things from an acoustic point of view. So there's just some prior approval checks that you need to do. So it's permitted development, but it's not guaranteed.
Well, actually, to add to that, I think the big misconception is that it is permitted development, which it's like you said, it's the prior approval to do something. If you meet criteria, you still have to do the application, and it is a quicker process. And the only major difference, I believe, in a prior approval to a full planning application is that the general public aren't consulted with in the same way as a full planning application.
They're consulted with, but they can't object on the grounds of anything except for those prior approval elements. If there is a specific element they raise, such as, oh, by the way, this roadside has flooded 3 years on the run, and that's genuine, then that's a comment against something that will come under prior approval.
But if they just say
too much,
I don't like HMOs, there's too many of them, that can't be considered because it's not under the sections of the prior approval.
There's no HMO prior approval, so which I think is an absolute mistake.
That's a good topic, actually. We could pick that up another time, but it would make more sense that there's a prior approval for commercial to HMOs than there is for commercial to flats in a way.
So you have to meet the space standards, waste management, highways, acoustics, fire, all of those sorts of things need to be taken into account. And bats. Don't forget about that. Ecology needs to be there as well. Need to consider and it's only a change of use. We want to talk about it's only change of use as well. So a common misconception on that one is that, I'm changing it to flats, I'm going to put a window in over there. No, you can't do that. So unless there's already a separate permitted development right for you to put that window in, you can't do that. You have to then apply for planning for that particular element.
Yeah, it's a fair point, isn't it?
It's only change of use.
If you've got a big commercial building and all the doors and windows match a internal flat scheme conversion, then you can do it under prior approval. But like you said, if you have to add in any windows or doors that aren't covered under the prior approval,
you need to get permission for that.
You need to get permission for that.
Absolutely. Exactly. And that's a big thing that people fall down on.
Yeah.
Cool. So use classes. So this is use classes under planning. We're going to talk about C3, C4, sui generis, and E, please.
Okay. So C3 is a dwelling house. So examples of a dwelling house are a terrace house, detached house, semi-detached house with one family or one house as part of it. A C4 is
a flatter apartment. You can have two people sharing there.
A flatter apartment with two people sharing. When it gets to the third, it may change class. We'll talk about shortly. C4 is a small HMO. So that is between 3 and 6 occupants. Yes, 3 and 6 occupants.
Not rooms.
Not rooms.
Occupants.
Not rooms, occupants. So you can have 6 double rooms with single occupants in it.
You could have 3 double rooms.
Or you could have 3 double
6
rooms.
In it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Sui generis, the terminology for that is it Latin for a class of its own. So the example that we talk about in our space is a large HMO, so 7 occupants or higher. It falls under the sui generis class. It's not a C4 class anymore. There's some other commercial classes that fall under sui generis that don't fall under the other.
Pubs is the most common one.
Yeah, pubs is an example.
It's basically anything that doesn't have a normal shape to it, right? Something that doesn't come under like
something that's a bit slightly
a bit unusual. Like you couldn't say that two pubs are the same. So it makes sense for it to be a class in its own, because if you're in a Wetherspoon, other pubs are available, and you have to go to the bathroom 3 miles away versus the mid-terrace pub where your bathroom's there. I mean, they're different things, aren't
different
they?
assessment criteria.
Different assessment criteria.
Yeah. And because lots of pubs, there's lots of really old pubs and new pubs, so they vary quite a bit, which is why they're under that class of its own.
Yeah. And the last one is E.
Class E is a commercial class of property where some different types of commercial use have been grouped together.
Yeah.
So, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head and some examples. So, like your standard shop is under Class E.
Where are we now?
Which other types of commercial property fall under Class E? Like office buildings.
It's mainly those
restaurants.
Two. Yeah, so retail,
restaurants,
some food eateries.
So a lot of. Does it include gaming?
No, I don't think it includes. Gaming. I think gaming sui generis.
I'm just trying to think on your general high street, the different commercial properties you got. Quite a lot of them will fall under Class E.
Yeah, so there used to be all different use classes, and then in 2020, I think they came into they brought in Class E to capture all. So
I think it was August 2021.
Was it 2021?
Yeah,
right.
I believe, or thereabouts.
And Class E is really important because that's the one that you can use the PD prior approval on.
Yes.
So
it's your typical ones that. Yeah, if you took the office as an example, you've got on the high street, you've got some on the ground floor, you've got some sort of retail shop, and above it, you've got office space. That's a Class E, and you can do a prior approval conversion to say flats.
Yeah.
As long as you don't have to change the windows of the doors and the external elements that we talked about before.
Cool. And then we're going to talk about that now, aren't we? So
yes, right. So G, Class G.
We'll do MA and G together because they're quite similar, aren't they?
Yeah.
So what we're talking about now is we're talking about prior approval classes under planning, right? Yeah. So why do you use classes for both the type of property and the type of planning? I don't know, but it's very confusing for everybody. Yeah. So we're no longer talking about the type of property when we say class. We're talking about a planning class that you can use. Permitted development under prior approval for the change of use only. Again, no external changes. Okay, so there's two that are the most commonly used ones for landlord developer. The first one is Class MA. MA, I don't think stands for anything other than that's the category. That's where it sits in the change order. And what it gives you the rights to is to change any unoccupied property that's wholly unoccupied for a period of 3 or more months as a commercial Class E unit, and you can convert the whole thing into residential property as long as you meet the prior approval standards that we talked about earlier. The building reg sizes, national space standards. Waste is a big one for if you're on a high street, waste management, all that kind of stuff. And the qualifying that there are limits on size. That's been consulted on at the minute. They're like I think it's like 1,500 meters or something. You can do it up to square meters internal space at the moment, but it's being consulted on at the moment. And then
consulted to up to 3,000, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Well, it might even be unlimited. They might unlimit it. It's not gone through yet, so we'll wait and see. We'll come back on that another time
to this podcast.
Yeah. So and then the other one is Class G, which gives you the right to convert the uppers on an occupied property. So it doesn't need to be vacant. So this is just typical, like you talked about earlier, high street shop maybe where the uppers aren't being used. You can then convert the uppers to residential up to, I think it's 2 flats.
Yeah, I think
it's 2 maximum. It's
flats.
not that useful, if I'm honest with you. It depends on the size of it. It depends on where it is as well. Because if it's a really high value area, then it might be worth it. But normally in our neck of the woods.
Because if your build cost to convert the 2 flats are say £100,000, but you're only going to add £100,000 worth of value to the property, it doesn't really stack up.
Yeah, it depends on the size as well.
But if you, like you said, if you convert the uppers in a really affluent area and you're spending £100,000, but you're adding £250,000 in the value by converting to flats, then it's worth looking at.
Yeah. So that's Class G. It's just 2 uppers converted to flats, basically. And then the last one that we'll talk about, key planning terms, building control and building regulation.
Right. So building regulation are the regulations that all building works need to be designed and constructed to. In the UK, that's the terminology for it. So building control are the body that register this.
Yeah.
It's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is how you're allowed to do it, and these guys are going to check it.
Yes, but they just register it because what they do is they register the initial notice for the application, then they register the certificate at the end. So it's clear that, you know, building regulations work had been applied for and some sort of certification exists. They do check it, but their certification doesn't necessarily mean that it 100% complies at all the time. That's not what it means. It's just the record of the certification in place for it to show that I believe everyone's done it to the best of their ability that complies with building regulations.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to describe it.
And it sits separately to planning.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what people sometimes fall down on.
Yes.
Which is you actually need to do both things. You can't just go off like you're planning.
Yes, and also building control can be a private company, and that they can be part of the council. So there's building control that are part of the council as well as private that do it. So it could be either.
Yeah. And the typical thing that we see is a planning application goes in.
Wouldn't it be great if there was a private planning?
Yeah, that would be super, to be fair.
Yeah. That'd be a way to streamline the systems and get rid of all the BS.
Yeah. So planning says yes, based on the drawings from the architect. Then it comes to the build phase, and the build phase says, actually, the planning drawings are slightly wrong, and my corridors can't meet 800 millimeters. Building control come in and say, you can or can't do that, and, you know, give you the nod.
Yeah,
That's it. That happens, right?
That's a good example.
Yeah.
And there is big differences in the drawings. So planning drawings really just diagrammatic. They just show this is the general layout. You know, it doesn't show the exact wall thicknesses, the M&E service requirements, the escape routes, all these sort of things. Whereas the building regulation drawings need to detail all that info that needs to get built and comply with the building regulations.
Yep. Good stuff. So that's a lot of technical jargon there. So we're going to move into the last one, which is tenanting terminology.
Right.
Which is as of today, which is pre-rental reform coming in. So we'll talk about that. So tenanting terminology, go ahead.
AST.
Yeah, so the AST stands for an assured short-hold tenancy agreement. What it means is you have an agreement between the landlord, whether that's an individual or company, and the tenant. Okay, so and that AST can be either for the whole property, or if it's HMO, it can be for a room with shared use for the communal spaces, etc., depending on what it is you're doing. But it's for a residential purpose, and it's over a period of time. So it's the regulated space within the landlord community. So it's not the same as service accommodation. It's not the same as commercial. It's regulated. Tenants have more rights. Residential tenants under ASTs have more rights. The difference between what it is now, which is the short hold tenancy, the short hold, is that it assures the short hold for a period of time that's agreed between those parties. So let's say it's a 6-month AST. That means you have a statutory assured short hold over that property for 6 months. Yeah. What's going to change is that becomes null, and it's a periodic tenancy from day one. Don't know what it will be called after that. It might just be called periodic tenancy, but that means it's just a rolling tenancy with whatever notice periods you have to give, etc.
To comply with the statutory
requirements and rules. Yeah. So at the moment, if an AST period ends and the tenancy continues, it rolls onto periodic anyway, with a 1 month, or whatever notice you've agreed. Actually, it's a 1 month typically notice for the end of tenancy. It might be a couple of weeks, up to you if you've shortened it, or it might be 2 months if you've lengthened it. But periodic, the new rules and regulations coming in saying, right, everything's periodic and it's within this rule structure. We don't know what that is as of today, but an AST is a short hold tenancy. Company let.
So company let agreements, I would say, are a commercial agreement with a residential property.
Yep.
And an example of that could be you've got a residential property, could be a C3 that we talked about before, C4 sui generis, and then you have one company let where they pay one lump of rent to you as the landlord per month. Mm-hmm. And then what they do with that property during that period depending on the terms of the company let, is kind of up to them. So they might then have separate ASTs with residents that move in, but they've got to manage those ASTs that we just talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, so your tenant is a company in effect, and it can, like you said, it can be company let for residential
and
property.
It could be, years, months, etc. Like the terms and the conditions are a bit more flexible because it's not governed under the residential
Tenancy,
AST.
Tenancy Act,
Yeah.
It's not, that's right, which brings on to the next one, actually.
Licenses and excluded licenses.
Yeah, so this is more common with a company let. So if you have a tenancy agreement with a company, they may only grant licenses to the people who are going to live in that property, whether that's employees or, more importantly, users. So let's say they have, they say it's a social housing provider, as an example, who takes on the property. They may only grant a license. Now, on a more typical basis, if you take somebody into your home and it's not a traditional let property, you can grant somebody a license for a room, as an example. So they may have license for the room and the common spaces, use of the common spaces, but you're not afforded the same rights and regulations as you are under a tenancy agreement. So if it terminates, it terminates. As an example, you don't have the same rights as under a standard tenancy agreement. So licenses are used quite often by companies under company lets, and that kind of stuff. Holiday let, serviced accommodation.
Right. So I think the best thing the determination here is that this is different to an AST. So it can be for residential use, but it's not governed under the same rules and regulations as an assured short hold tenancy because it's a short term let. So the requirements are generally the terms and conditions of, say, the booking that's in place. So if the booking's, say, for 4 days and someone refuses to leave, they're not covered under the AST. Or
they're effectively trespassing.
They're trespassing, and you could change the locks at that point. Whereas someone under an AST, you can't do that. There's a much more stringent eviction process, as an example. So that's where that differentiates. So if you do a booking, say through Booking.com or Airbnb or something like that, you're just governed by the T's and C's that they have in essence as to what you can and can't do. Generally, they'll hold your credit card details. So if you damage something, they can just charge you automatically without real other proof needed or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Depends on the term. It's a commercial. It's a
commercial agreement, isn't it? Yeah. And obviously, usually the T's and C's just hidden in the small print when you book, so most people don't read them. Ending tenancies and occupation agreements.
So I've categorized this as a whole, right? So we're going to talk about residential, and I'm going to use sections currently how we end a residential tenancy agreement and or occupation agreement. So we talked about licenses. You can terminate a license based on whatever the terms of the license are, and there's no blowback. From a service accommodation perspective, you can terminate based on the details of the booking. When it comes to residential, there's only 2 ways a tenancy can end. That is either by the tenant agreeing the tenancy is ended, or the court has agreed the tenancy is ended and granted possession back to the landlord. And this is a big thing. So people don't understand that. Now, to get to that position, you need to have given the correct type of notice. Okay. So at the moment, there's 2 most common types of notice. There are others, but I'm only going to talk about the 2 most common types. One is called a Section 21 notice, and the other is called a Section 8 notice. So Section 21 notice is a catch-all notice. There's no reason that you have
no
to
fault
give.
eviction,
So
basically.
no fault eviction. You just want to take the property back from that particular
and
tenant.
you don't have to give a reason to
Exactly, for any reason. You don't have to do it.
There is a certain notice period, though.
So it's 2 months after you can prove that the tenant should have received that notice. So that's an important point. So
very important.
We fell foul of this, right? So it can't be 2 months from when you post it. It's 2 months from when they should have received it. So you need to allow, if you're hand delivering, it's from that date. If you're not hand delivering, then it needs to be with reasonable notice for the post or whatever.
Maybe allow 2 months and a week as an example if it's postage to give enough time.
Absolutely. And you need a receipt of service to make sure that that's happened. Now, but that again, that 2 months notice is only if you're going for the accelerated possession. You can do the normal possession claim online process, which is you still have to go through all the possession criteria to get to the court appointment. It will take longer than an accelerated possession, not massively longer being open, but it will take a little bit longer. And there's lots of things to do with that Section 21. There's lots of like slips, trips and falls. You have to have got like EIC in date, gas in date. EICR. Well, it's not actually EICR, but EICR should be done anyway. Yeah. Right to rent needs to be issued. Deposit certs need to have been issued. There's lots of slips, trips and falls anyway with Section 21 accelerated possession procedure. That's with the normal possession procedure, you can still give a Section 21 notice and go down that route. The second one is Section 8. So Section 8 is a fault. It's not it is fault based. There's a reason for the eviction. And it's not necessarily fault necessarily of the tenant, but there's a reason for the eviction. So it could be a mandatory reason, such as the property is in such a state of disrepair that it's no longer tenantable. That's not necessarily the tenant's fault.
Antisocial behaviour is one, isn't it?
But fault-based could be antisocial behaviour. It's hard to prove. Yeah. The most common reason is rent arrears. Yeah. So if you fall 2 months behind on rent arrears currently, you can issue a Section 8 notice, and that Section 8 notice can be 14 days, at which point if the tenant makes payment, notice is cancelled. If they don't, then you can apply to the courts. And that's the important thing that people don't get. At the end of your Section 21 or Section 8 notice, it doesn't give you the right. You have to then apply to the courts for that right to evict. The other way is the tenant can terminate the contract, and you can do so by mutual consent, that you've given consent. And that can actually, a mutual consent can be any time.
The tenant notice period at the moment?
The tenant notice period is whatever it says in the contract. Yeah. So it could be a month. Statutory is, normally is 4 weeks or a month's notice. You can shorten that to 2 weeks or lengthen it, I think, to 8 weeks, I think. It's up to you and the tenant. But if it's in the statutory period, the tenant can't give that notice unless it's by mutual consent. That's the only difference is, and we sometimes see it where they want to leave early and then you negotiate an exit and that kind of stuff for the tenant, or you say no.
Yeah, so a way is if they wanted to leave early, the key is you don't want void periods. You don't have the expense of that, do you? So, if the tenant agrees to pay the lettings fee or something like that, and a new tenant moves in and there's no void period, then, that's a fair way to do that negotiation.
Yeah. So Section 21 is a notice. Section 8 is a notice. Everything is a notice under the contract. You still have to go to the courts to get possession. Okay.
Right.
Final one.
I'm going to keep going with you for these questions because I think you're going to be better than me. So notices, court orders, and legal process, because that builds from your last response, really. Yeah,
okay. So the notices is the Section 8 and the Section 21. A court order is what's granted after you've been to let's say you've done the accelerated possession and you've met all the character criteria and the court's happy that you followed the process, they grant you a court order. Okay, and that court order is for possession of the property. That possession order is then given to the tenant, and that tenant is normally given a timeline. It's usually like 14 days or something to exit the property. Same for the Section 8.
Just a question then.
Yeah.
So that 14-day period has ended.
Yep.
Tenant hasn't left.
Yep.
They've gone out to do the shopping.
Yep.
You go in and change the locks.
No.
Can you do that?
No, you can't.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to evict that tenant. So at that point, a court-ordered bailiff needs to be appointed.
Yeah.
And that bailiff can go and exit that tenant. You cannot do anything of the sort. No.
Yeah.
That is a legal practice.
Whereas this is where it differs from a commercial property, depending on your contract, of course. But if a commercial tenant isn't paying rent and they're in breach of the contract, you can just go and change the locks, can't you?
Yeah. So the bailiff will get the possession of your property back. That's how that happens. Yeah. And even to the point where that can be set aside if there's a technical reason that the bailiff turns up and can't gain access for any reason. That would mean you have to start that process again.
The bailiff process again?
No. It could be the court order process.
Right.
So it can go all the way back to the beginning of the court order process because something technically isn't correct. As an example, you've applied for the tenant and the tenant is actually living in the property. Let's say you had a partnership, tenant one married or got with a partner, tenant one left, partner is there and she's been paying the rent. She's effectively a tenant in occupancy. You've not done anything about it. Effectively, she's a tenant. She's a common law tenant, and would come under you would have to reapply for that.
Reapply.
Yeah. So you've got to be really careful on those kind of things.
Just back on that example there.
Yeah.
If you did change the locks when someone went for their shopping and you've got the court order, what could happen to yours alone?
Well, I mean, I would say that you're going to get fined. There's fines of some description. I'm not sure whether you're going to jail. I don't like to comment, but I mean, it's definitely not a legal practice. I wouldn't recommend it. It's something that you would have to take a view upon. It's also a bit harsh. But I mean, they haven't paid the rent and if they haven't paid the rent, they haven't left the property then.
Yeah. Let's say they haven't paid rent for 12 months.
Yeah.
They've trashed the property.
Yeah.
The court order's been in place.
Yeah.
I would say a lot of landlords at that point will be thinking, I can change the locks now.
Well, we bought property and the tenant's been evicted on the day, right? And we've not done that. They've just been evicted by the previous landlord. Said, right, you need to leave today. I'm moving your stuff out.
Which is in no way
what happened to that person, the landlord? Nothing, because the tenant took no action. So it comes down to the tenant's action at that point, right? So, and/or if there's a court appointed professional, they may also take action against you. Commercial lease. All right. So this is a lease between the landlord and a business or a commercial operation. It's very, very different to the residential that you're talking about there, because it's not governed by the same sort of rules and regulations as an AST as before. So it's a lot more flexible on the terms and conditions, I'd say. It's normally on a commercial property.
Yeah.
And it can be for the whole or part of that property, right?
Yeah, it can be for any section of the commercial property. I don't know if there's a minimum space standard, but it could be very small, couldn't it? If it's a small shop that just operates from the front of the building, it could be that. The terms, it could be a short term, it could be a very long term. You can do things like rent increases across that term.
You can index link them.
You can index link them, and there can be, certain responsibilities for insurance payment, things like that.
And the big thing is you can do whatever you want necessarily with a commercial term. So you can say, right, you are becoming responsible of the lease for the whole lock stock of the property. So it's a full repair and insure.
Yes.
So it's roof, walls, everything.
Yeah,
internal.
or it could be a part.
It could be internal repair and insure. Or it could be furnished. It can actually be furnished. You can furnish it and say, I will take responsibility. The insurance of those, you need to be responsible for the maintenance of those. But the contract determines what. So
a key thing that you see in these agreements that a lot of landlords don't realise is that the tenant will generally be responsible for building regulations.
Yeah.
So let's say the tenant moves in, it's just a base empty shell.
Yep.
They fit out as a restaurant.
Yeah.
That tenant under the commercial lease should have to comply with building regulations, get building control sign off, and then issue it to the landlord as proof, etc. So that's an example.
Yeah, and then we talked about termination. So termination is either the end of the lease, and then they don't have a right to continue, or if they fail to pay rent, you have rights as a landlord to take back that property.
Yeah,
and that's very
depending on the terms agreed in the lease.
Yeah,
you can take back possession.
You can't be brutal with it. You have to be,
there's certain requirements for notice and all those sort of things, and requests for payments, and there will be a process in the lease you have to follow. But as long as
there's no third party. There's no court practice or there's no 2 months notice or anything like that. There's a statutory right. I've followed the rules and regulations. Consult with this solicitor. What do I have to do? And then basically change the locks, which is what you talked about. If they're just not able to meet the terms.
And a lot of businesses, because they know the AST system, generally think that they're covered in a similar way, whereas a commercial lease is very different because it's not governed the same as a place that you live in.
And generally, if you get a big commercial lease and you're the let's call it the grandfather leaseholder, you can split it up if you wanted.
Yep.
So you could lease out the parts. You don't have to lease the whole building. You could lease the whole building yourself, and then you could do lease to lease. You could lease out sections of it. So if you've got a massive commercial building, you want to split it up. That's a good strategy. In my opinion.
Yeah, and that can be a back-to-back lease as well.
Yeah, on a back-to-back basis. Right, I think that's enough jargon for one day.
That is lots of jargon.
Hopefully we've busted some myths.
Yeah. You've learned all the terminology.
Plain English. Yeah, it is. I mean, you can see even after 5 years of doing it, we still get confused on certain elements. But we hope that was useful. And as always, do your own due diligence. Some of that is our opinion. And thank you very much for your time, Tim.
Thanks very much.
And we'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you once again for joining us on the Financial Freedom Podcast, sponsored by us at Property Portfolio Building. If you want to get in touch with us about today's podcast or any of the learning topics that we've gone through today, you can email us at podcast@invest-prop.co.uk or get in touch with us with whichever your social media platform of choice is. If you think you would add value to us as a guest on this podcast, you can please get in touch and let us know what you would be able to talk to us about. Other than that, we wish you well on your financial freedom journeys. And once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.